Very pleased to be here. So as Menno said, I'm going to show sort of 3 projects, and it's kind of, I'm a designer, I do all sorts of things, but then occasionally like an idea comes along that you just kind of can't shake, and it sort of takes over your life a bit. And so the first project was this idea that came along maybe when I was a young man, let's say. And it was this idea, okay, I'm a designer, I make things, I'm very familiar with technology, blah, 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 blah. But surely I should make at least one thing entirely myself from the ground up, like a life goal. And so I thought, yes, I need to do this. And the object I chose to make was a cheap, simple electric toaster. And so I went and bought one for about £5, took it home, took it apart, and inside this very inexpensive object who had this one function of toasting bread, there's kind of 400 different bits that have been assembled, made of maybe 100 different materials. And so I was like, okay, all right, where do I start? So I kind of simplified, substituted, and realized that I could maybe make a decent electric toaster with just 5 materials: copper, mica, steel, nickel, and plastic. So I began with steel, like the basics, right? So I went to the Royal School of Mines in London and kind of knocked on the door of the Rio Tinto Chair of Advanced Mineral Extraction, Professor Cilliers, and said, I'm trying to make a toaster. I need to make some steel. Can you tell me how to make steel? And, very kindly, he invited me into his office and sat me down, and we had this conversation. Kind of, reminding me of this vague idea that steel is kind of an alloy of iron, so I need to get some iron first, so I need some iron ore. So I went and phoned up the nearest iron mine I could find to London.
Okay.
Hello, can I speak to Jonathan, please?
He's underground at the moment.
Oh, he's underground. Oh. Well, I'm sort of embarking on a project. I'm trying to make a toaster, and I need to get some iron ore to make the steel bits inside the toaster.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if I could come down there and get some iron ore.
Yes, you can do.
Can I?
So I was led into this mine and had very interesting conversations with the kind of retired miner that led me down. But, I ended up with this, a suitcase full of iron ore, dragged it back to London, opened it up in the professor's office, and, okay, what do we do now? And he said, okay, go to the library. So I went to the undergraduate science library, looking through all sorts of books on metallurgy for beginners iron smelting, breakout box number 1.1, this is how you do it. But there was there was lots of, masses of information about electron orbits and reduction reactions, but no simple kind of recipe. So I ended up going around the corner to the Science Museum, the History of Science Library, and looking in books like this. This is De Re Metallica, a 15th century book. And, that kind of lovely woodcut of the earliest form of smelting is basically what I was able to manage in a car park in London. I had started out this project with this idea that I was only going to use kind of pre-technological tools that had already gone out the window by this point. So I was using a leaf blower instead of a set of bellows. But after basically all night shoveling in kind of carbon and iron ore into this kind of furnace, I managed to melt the furnace, but then when everything had cooled down, looking through the kind of the melted heap, I found this. And I was like, my God, I've done it. this is steel, this is iron. It's no longer rusty iron oxide red. It's this lovely grey metallic colour. It was very heavy, magnetic. It kind of even tasted of metal. So, went to the pub and boasted, I've made iron, it took mankind 20,000 years, blah, blah. I did it in one go. But then when I actually went to start kind of working this iron, it would just shatter. It was not ductile. So I went and did some more research, realized I'd done everything wrong, and then kind of realized that on the scale at which I was working, it was very much like an artisanal practice. And even if I went to the mine, got more iron ore, built my furnace again, did all the process again, there would be no guarantee of success that time or that time, because basically I needed to have done a kind of apprenticeship with a sort of 16th century iron smelter to kind of understand the smell of the gas and the kind of color of the flame. So I started thinking about, well, how can I experiment more quickly? How can I kind of work out the recipe more quickly without going through all of this bother of making a furnace? So I started thinking, okay, well, what's a more convenient, fire? Well, an oven's a more convenient fire, but that's not going to work. What's a more convenient oven? So I went and borrowed my mum's microwave, and turns out 30 minutes at full power, if you insulate well enough, you can just about get up to the temperature that you need to kind of finish off this reaction that I was going for. And yes, so, various other things for mica and copper, more visits to abandoned mines, but I'm going to skip all that because I want to talk about plastic. And so plastic, as we know, comes from oil, fossil fuels, fossil gases, and it's this thing which designers use to hide the kind of mess of components inside an object. And so I was determined that my toaster should have a lovely plastic case. So I phoned up BP, tried to convince them it would be fantastic PR if they would fly me to an oil rig in the North Sea and let me get a jug of crude. They, were half interested, but they said, okay, we'll phone you back if we can think of a way of making this work. Never phoned back, but while I was waiting for the call, I started investigating bioplastics, plastics made from starch, and kind of extracting the starch from potatoes, mixing up this resin, tipping it into my mold, which I'd carved from a tree trunk, the mold for the plastic case. But each time, the plastic wasn't up to it, it would shrink and crack. And after failure, I decided I would think laterally and take advantage of the idea that we've moved into a new geological era, the Anthropocene, and one of the kind of supposed markers of the Anthropocene is this idea that there would be the sudden appearance of new types of polymers in the kind of strata of rock, kind of fossilized plastic, basically. And so I thought, well, I've mined all this very ancient rock. Can I mine some of this new plastic-bearing rock from the many piles on the street? So that's what I decided I would have to do. But before kind of doing that, I went up to a plastics recycling factory and had a very interesting conversation about the WE legislation with this guy, who was the CEO of this factory.
That would be individual closed-loop producer responsibility. There's no benefit for that under the legislation. Does flame retardancy mean anything to you at all? Or?
Yeah. I was wondering if I could actually mine some brominated flame retardants from myself and put them in my toaster. But
oh dear.
So there's my toaster without its case. There's the toaster in its finished form. And there it is on the shelves for the bargain price of £1,187.54, because I was doing this project for about a year, and this was as good as I could get. And so, yes, so kind of, I guess with the project, I was trying to work out how stuff can be so cheap, this kind of wonderful existence that we have with all of these kind of cheap consumer products that, you know, inevitably nowadays can't be fixed, all of that kind of stuff. And so, you know, we can't keep going on like this. But then also there's this issue of like, well, you know, these people want toasters, they want stuff as well. So if we're kind of wishing for things to become more expensive, what are we going to do then? And so this project, it kind of became a book, and it was a way of like trying to work out like this, you know, this impossible situation that we're in. And so a few years later, kind of, you know, doing other projects, lots of other things, even a misguided foray into a TV show, terrible idea. I'm like at a bit of a lull, let's say. The career is not doing so well. You know, I'm sort of worried about money. You know, I'm sort of arguing with my girlfriend a lot. And then, of course, there's the big worries, the like climate change kind of coming along. And I'm looking after a dog sitting, and just kind of having a coffee, sort of thinking about my life. And I have that thought, which, you know, I think is a kind of common thought, especially when you're a kid, which is like, you're so lucky. You don't have to deal with any of this like complexity. You don't have to worry about anything. You're just there, kind of having a nice time, you know, eating stuff off the street. You know, Noggin, the dog's name is Noggin. Wouldn't it be nice to be you? And, you know, I'm not the first person that's kind of grappled with this question, is ignorance bliss? I think, you know, John Stuart Mill, founder of utilitarianism, was, you know, one of the advocates of utilitarianism, always was, you know, had to argue that no, it's always better to know, it's always better to be the more conscious being, the me, and understand more. However, Noggin has a very nice life, you know, maybe ignorance is bliss. Just stop reading the news, just, you know, live a happy life. And so this kind of idea of like just escape, just galloping away, wouldn't it be lovely to just gallop away, escape? It just became this kind of idea that wouldn't let go. And because I didn't have much else on, I wrote a kind of funding application to a kind of art science foundation, and to my surprise, they gave me some money to do it. And I'd said to the Wellcome Trust that I wanted to become an elephant. And I hadn't given it that much thought. I just thought, you know, an elephant, it would be nice. It's like a very impervious animal. You know, it's not a prey animal, but then it's kind of not really a kind of hunting sort of animal. It just seemed like a good thing to be. And of course, you have a trunk, so you can like spray people with water, and it'd be nice. Nice life as an elephant. However, you know, got the money, did some more research, realized that in fact, trying to escape existential angst by becoming an elephant was a bad thing to do, a bad target animal, because it turns out, you know, elephants, us, dolphins, kind of chimpanzees maybe, you know, we're all part of this very small group that seem to understand their own mortality. And, you know, elephants will exhibit this kind of mourning behavior when there's been a traumatic death in the family. And they live, their families are very big, very complex, these very complex groups. And the kind of complexity of family was exactly the kind of thing I was trying to escape from. So what did I do? I went to the pub and was moaning to a friend, oh, I've got all this money to become an elephant, but I don't want to be an elephant anymore. What do I do? And she made the excellent suggestion that I should go and see a friend of hers who was an expert in human-animal transformation, a shaman. So I visited this lady, Annette, at her kind of little house outside of Copenhagen to ask her what animal I should be. Hi. Hello, Annette. Hello.
Good timing.
Hi, thank you. Wow, it's an amazing little community, sort of,
It is.
houses
Sorry,
and
it's
so
just
on.
I've been doing garden work recently.
Okay. Is it okay if I film, Annette?
If
Or
you
is
what?
is it okay if I film video things? No. So she quite rightly, pointed out that putting a camera in the room changes the energy. And she sat me down, and she was great, really. She completely got what I was trying to do, where I was coming from, and pointed out, that I was an idiot for thinking I could become an elephant. I could only hope to be an animal that I had some kind of shared cultural history, some sort of shared social history with. If I'd grown up in the bush in Africa, then maybe I could become an elephant. But no, you grew up in the suburbs of London, so what animals do you have there? Well, you've got lots of squirrels, you could become a squirrel. And my heart's kind of sinking. Who wants to be a squirrel? And then she said, well, a sheep. And it's like, oh, I don't want to be a sheep. But then she said, well, actually, how about a goat? And as soon as she said it, I was like, yes, that's the animal I should be. And she also pointed out that my kind of idea, my new idea, was an idea that people have been, trying to do for possibly as long as we've been kind of cognitively modern people. Earliest cave paintings show drawings of kind of human, animal, people, shamans. And so I kind of started thinking, well, what can present-day science and technology say about this ancient human dream? So I started pestering experts like Dr. McElliott at Queen Mary University, who's a goat behavioral psychologist, and he took me to see his research subjects, and we discussed what makes my mind different from a goat's mind. And he said, well, we may never be able to answer that question because fundamentally it's impossible to know what another being's experience of the world is. But, judging from their behavior, we think that unlike humans, goats don't have this ability to, this is called nested scenario planning, nested scenario building. They don't kind of make stories and then kind of make stories within those stories. They don't make their life into a story. And of course, goats don't have this compulsion to share their stories with other members of their species. So I went to a neuroscientist and said, could you switch off the parts of my mind that make me different from a goat? And this is Dr. Devlin, who uses transcranial magnetic stimulation to induce virtual lesions in people's brains. And he had a go at my brain. Using this very powerful electromagnet.
Use that trip trapping over my bridge as well. Yeah.
And he's trying to get this patch called Broca's area, which would interrupt my ability to speak. Normally, you would kind of do it with an MRI and a 3D model of the subject's brain, but he was just kind of judging it and occasionally getting the nerves down into my teeth, so it was a very unpleasant afternoon. But he said, look, Thomas, you're asking too much. This is, what you want to do is at least 50 years away. Our understanding of the brain is just nowhere near developed enough to selectively turn off pathways to adjust your experience of the world. So come back in 50 years. And so while I'm waiting, I started looking at the body. And the body, I thought, was going to be the easy bit, right? Because we have all this shared anatomy. So I started making these like exoskeletons that were going to let me bound along the mountainside as a goat. However, this is kind of prototype 2. it was not the kind of graceful sort of experience that I was hoping for. And of course, I'd been inspired by the kind of quadruped robots that you see, these amazing creatures. So I went to see a professor who had worked on some of those and said, what am I doing wrong? I've got all the sensor package, I've got the actuators, I just need a bit of adjusting. And as Professor Hutchinson is showing me round his work at the Royal Veterinary College Structure and Motion Lab. He kind of explains, well, he's in the middle of dissecting a snow leopard, but he explains that, it's actually easier to start from scratch. We're so highly evolved as a biped that to kind of make that into a quadruped is more difficult than, than just kind of making a robot run on 4 legs. And I said, wow, a snow leopard, that's cool. How many goats have you dissected? And to my surprise, he said none. So I said, well, could we dissect a goat? And he said, sure, if you bring me a dead goat. So I started thinking, where could I get a dead goat from? So I went back to the goat sanctuary. And it's a very different thing because all of these goats have names. And so they, after a long conversation, discussion, they said there is a goat called Venus who is dying of a mysterious disease. And so if you get the vets to do a biopsy and tell us what she's dying from, then you can have her body when she dies. And so Venus died. Unfortunately, she died on a Sunday, so she had to spend the night in my fridge. But then the next day begins this kind of very interesting process, which happens to millions of animals a week. This kind of process of watching an animal turn from something which is very clearly an animal into something which is much more familiar from like a kind of butcher's shop or supermarket. But it was this very visceral kind of, demonstration of the difference between the engineering approach that I'd been taking and an evolutionary approach. And so on the left, there's the engineered bracket, and on the right, there's the, evolved, generatively designed bracket. So I started thinking of this suit as the interface between engineering and biology, which is, of course, prosthetics. So I went to some doctors of prosthetics, and they invited me up to their clinic and agreed to make me some prosthetic legs. While they were doing that, I looked at guts, because, of course, I wasn't going to be very free of human concerns if I had to worry about where my next meal was coming from. And so I started thinking, well, I need a rumen, an artificial rumen, which will let me digest grass. So I made myself an artificial rumen, and I took it up to some ruminant biologists, and they showed me their artificial rumen. And I explained what I was going to do, and they nodded along. And I said, well, will you provide me the rumen fluid from inside a healthy goat when the time comes? Because that's what I needed to kind of create this culture, this artificial rumen that I would strap to my torso. And they said yes. And then when the time came, they didn't send me the rumen fluid. They sent me a letter from the university lawyers saying that any suggestion that they'd encouraged me on this foolhardy pursuit was entirely false. But I didn't have time to argue. I just needed to go and live the goat life on a goat farm in the Swiss Alps, which was run by Sepp, this man who, he hadn't been down the mountainside to the town for 6 years. And I turned up and said, Sepp, I know I've been saying that I'm interested in goats, but Sepp, I'm really interested in goats, so much so that I want to become one of your goats. And amazingly, he said, yeah, fine, make yourself at home. The goat shed is over there. So he pointed me off to this shed. And but he said, look, tomorrow, Thomas, I'm going to move the goats to another place. And I'm like, Sepp, don't worry, you won't even notice me. Just do what you would normally do. I'm just going to blend in. And then, so tomorrow, at the crack of dawn, I'm there. I'm doing it. I'm living the dream. But all too quickly, the landscape in the Alps is pretty steep. It became steeper and steeper, and the goats just flowed down the hill, down the mountainside, and left me behind, alone on the mountain. But I just kind of plodded along. My prosthetics are giving me blisters. My inadequate testing in London was just not up to the job. But at the very end of the day, I finally reached where the goats are going to be having their new pasture. And I'm there for 3 days and 3 nights, trying to forget that I'm a human, trying to forget that goat's breath smells really extremely powerful, trying to survive on grass, which obviously I don't manage. And after 3 days, and there's I almost get into a fight with the goats. I have to set off because I promised the Wellcome Trust that I was going to try and cross the Alps. And this is where it kind of crosses into fantasy. But it turns out, as long as I keep going up, there's more weight on my back legs. And basically, the steeper the better. And I disappear into the Alps. And after I got back to a nice warm bed and a nice cup of coffee, I start to wonder, what was this project actually about? And why was it so uncomfortable, not just physically, but also spiritually? And I realize it's because it was kind of going against this idea that this will, at some point, lead to this.
Space.
And
The final
I'd just
frontier.
grown up watching a lot of Star Trek and had
These are the
soaked up
voyages
this
of the
myth
Starship
that,
Enterprise.
there's going to be kind of bumps along the way, but humanity, we're progressing from the cave to the stars sort of thing. And wanting to become a goat and trying to become a goat was like rejecting that story in favor of another story, which is living and dying a life on a mountainside, not trying to contribute to the great project, just trying to tread lightly on the earth. And social psychologists, Ernest Becker in the 70s, he argued that in fact these stories are what basically drive humans to form, to be religious, to be nationalistic, to have children, and to kind of have this myth of progress. And so this is Venus posed as a biped, and yes, this book also became a book as well. Okay, yes. Okay, I'm out of time. I've got one more project, but yeah. Okay, I'll go quickly. And so what I'm working on now began with, married the girlfriend, had children. This is my daughter, angelic, lovely person who has just kicked me in the face because she hates being strapped into her car seat. And each time it's this struggle, and I start to think, well, maybe she's right because cars are very dangerous. She doesn't want to get in this machine. And cars, turns out they're the leading killer of children, leading cause of violent death, responsible for more suffering, basically a lot of unintended consequences. And so I start to think, well, maybe, wouldn't it be nice to make a harmless thing, a harmless car? But then you have to think, well, harmless to who? And so I start off, well, harmless to my daughter. That doesn't seem very fair. Harmless to other road users. Again, what about the tailpipe emissions, harmless to the local area? Well, what about the global implications of this car? Harmless to people globally. What about harmless to people in the future, the future generations? What about harmless to people in the past? I'm not sure how we would do that, but we'll see. And hold on, why just people? What about harmless to other people, other life forms? So I start to think, okay, this car has to be harmless, following this kind of Jainist principle, utterly harmless to all forms of life in perpetuity. So I start pestering experts. This is Professor Jun Woo at Delft University, and I say I want to make a harmless car, and we kind of work out, well, it needs to have a space frame, and he does this nice kind of diagram because I've decided I'm going to weave this car out of willow. And so that's what I was doing at Amstel Park last summer for this project, trying to weave a car chassis, trying to understand wheels by visiting one of the last wagon makers in the Netherlands. Wheels are complicated. There's a lot to them. We've come a long way since wagons. And so I'll just kind of skip through. This is where it's got to so far. Struggling with how to make it completely harmless, demonstration. Question is how to make this car go. I try sail power. Eventually I start slipping with the harmlessness in pursuit of just being able to drive it. But I think really the car is about, like, what is the future? What is this vision of the future? Is it this? Is it this? But the question really is like, well, okay, if the goat was really about doing no harm and the toaster was about everything is connected, well, now that we live on spaceship Earth, it's kind of a paradox. It's this, you can't be harmless. And so if you're going to be harmful, if there's inevitable harm, then you have to start thinking, well, who deserves the harm? And so one answer is our own lifestyles, another answer is future generations. I don't know, it's just the flip side of creating benefit. So there we go, thank you.